Over the last 2 decades, China has greatly increased its infrastructure projects in almost every African country. This involvement involves enormous expenditures in roads, trains, ports, and other key infrastructure, with loans totaling more than $140 billion for various projects. As of 2020, around 49 African countries had signed agreements under China's Belt and Road Initiative, demonstrating the scope of these initiatives. China-Africa commerce has increased from $11.67 billion in 2000 to $257.67 billion in 2022, making China the primary commercial partner for many African countries, overtaking traditional partners such as the United Kingdom and the United States. Chinese FDI flows to Africa increased from $75 million in 2003 to a high of $5 billion in 2021. Western critics coined the term debt trap diplomacy to describe China's strategy. This concept implies that China makes loans for infrastructure projects that recipient countries cannot afford to repay, allowing China to exercise strategic dominance over these countries. Zambia and Uganda are frequently mentioned as examples. Zambia, for example, is significantly indebted to China, owing nearly $5.05 billion, which accounts for roughly 30% of its entire external debt and 20% of its GDP. According to the provisions of their credit agreements, China may take over Entebbe International Airport in Uganda. Proponents say that China's investments have improved Africa's infrastructure and provided considerable economic benefits. They point out that numerous Chinese initiatives have generated jobs, expanded economic prospects, and improved connectivity. For example, the Chinese telecommunications corporation Huawei has expanded digital access to 40 African countries. Furthermore, Chinese-built railways, such as the one that connects Nairobi and Mombasa in Kenya, are viewed as important to bolstering local economies. Critics in the West claim that these advantages are outweighed by long-term economic dangers and a lack of transparency in Chinese credit deals. They argue that the secrecy and likely exploitative character of these loans threaten African governments' sovereignty and financial stability. Defenders of China's involvement, on the other hand, emphasize the historical context of Western colonialism as well as the continued need for infrastructure in Africa, which Western countries have failed to address adequately. They believe that characterizing Chinese investments as debt trap diplomacy oversimplifies the intricate economic linkages and mutual advantages generated from these initiatives. In this video, we look into the heart of China's relationship with Africa, including why many African governments choose collaborations with China over those with Western nations. Traditionally, the United States and Europe have focused on giving aid and social services to Africa, stressing humanitarian assistance, healthcare, education, and poverty eradication. Western aid frequently includes requirements for governance, transparency, and human rights, which can cause delays in grant release. Western donors, for example, have provided major funding for health emergencies such as HIV, AIDS, and Ebola. In contrast, China's policy in Africa has been mainly centered on infrastructure development. China has spent billions of dollars building roads, railroads, ports, and other key infrastructure. This investment is part of the bigger Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, which seeks to improve global trade routes and connectivity. As of 2020, around 49 African countries had signed onto the BRI, demonstrating China's substantial influence in the region. Chinese initiatives in Africa include the Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway in Kenya, as well as a number of other transportation and energy projects. China's approach is frequently marked by a lack of political constraints, which might make its investments more enticing to African leaders who are tired of the strings tied to Western aid. Now let's look at how African leaders perceive the approaches of both the West and China. African leaders have stated their support for China's approach over the old Western aid strategy. They argue that infrastructure development is critical for economic growth and development. Hence, they prefer trade and corporate partnerships to aid and charity. This mentality is reflected in a number of comments and agreements that prioritize economic cooperation and infrastructural development with China. African leaders like being considered as trade partners rather than assistance recipients, which is consistent with their goals for development through commerce and infrastructure. Let's look at the scope and impact of some of China's recent projects. China funded and completed the Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway, or SGR, which considerably enhanced Kenya's transportation efficiency. The 480-kilometer railway, which was finished in 2017 for $3.8 billion, cuts travel time between Mombasa and Nairobi from nearly 10 hours to roughly 4.5 hours for passengers and less than 8 hours for cargo. The project, principally funded by China Exim Bank, increased cargo transport capacity to 22 million tons per year and provided approximately 25,000 jobs for Kenyans, contributing 1.5% of Kenya's GDP growth. The 756-kilometer Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway, completed in 2016, connects Ethiopia's capital to Djibouti's port. The $4 billion project, mostly funded by China, is East Africa's first modern electrified railway. It has significantly improved trade logistics for landlocked Ethiopia, reducing freight transportation time from more than 3 days to less than 20 hours and lowering costs by at least 1/3. The railway has delivered 9.5 million tons of commodities and enabled a 20% rise in port activity in Djibouti, making a substantial contribution to regional economic integration and growth. The Abuja-Kaduna Railway, completed in 2016, connects Nigeria's capital, Abuja, to Kaduna, the country's commercial hub. This $876 million project, built by the China Civil Engineering Construction Corporation, or CSCC, has greatly improved regional connectivity and spurred economic activity. It decreases travel time between the cities to only 1 hour for passenger trains, which can achieve speeds of up to 250 kilometers per hour and 1.5 hours for cargo trains. The railway created over 4,000 jobs during construction and is expected to generate over 5,000 more employment in operation and maintenance. Let us now look at the West Africa connection from a historical standpoint. Between the 1950s and the 1970s, numerous African countries obtained independence from European colonial powers. During this time, Western countries, primarily the United States and European nations, supplied major finance for key infrastructure projects in Africa through organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. This assistance sought to stabilize newly independent countries and promote economic development. However, by the 1960s and 1970s, the emphasis of Western investment had switched. The early enthusiasm for sponsoring large-scale infrastructure projects dissipated, and the Western strategy shifted away from infrastructure development and toward social service help. As former colonial governments curtailed their financial support for maintenance and new initiatives, most of the legacy infrastructure, which was primarily developed during the colonial period, fell into disrepair. In contrast, China's connection with Africa at this time was marked by ideological and political assistance. In the 1960s, China actively supported African countries' resistance to imperialism and colonialism, encouraging non-alignment and African unity. Notable projects included the construction of the Tanzania-Zambia Railway, TEZARA, which was funded and developed by China, and represented China's dedication to African development free of colonialism. China's investments in Africa have expanded dramatically since the early 2000s, as part of a drive to expand markets and political influence. This effort capitalizes on China's expertise in executing large-scale infrastructure projects swiftly and economically, making it a desirable partner for many African countries. China's approach is informed by its own developmental experiences and surplus capital, which are perfectly aligned with Africa's developmental requirements. China-Africa commerce has skyrocketed from $11.67 billion in 2000 to $257.67 billion in 2022, making China the largest trading partner for several African countries, overtaking traditional partners such as the United Kingdom and the United States. Chinese FDI flows to Africa grew from $75 million in 2003 to a high of $5 billion in 2021, but fell to $1.8 billion in 2022. Notable investments include the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, ICBC, purchasing a 20% interest in Standard Bank of South Africa in 2008. China has participated in a number of infrastructure projects in Africa, including the development of railways, roadways, and power plants. These projects are frequently sponsored with loans and grants as part of bigger financial pledges, such as China's $60 billion pledge during the 2015 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. China's investments are mostly centered on mining, construction, and manufacturing. Between 2000 and 2022, 89% of Africa's exports to China were primary commodities such as oil, copper, and iron ore, while imports from China were predominantly manufactured items such as electronics and textiles. From 2000 to 2022, Chinese lenders granted around $170.08 billion in loans to African countries, with a large share focused on the energy industry. Despite the massive influx of cash, questions regarding debt sustainability have arisen, particularly in Angola, Ethiopia, and Zambia, which are among the top borrowers. Western governments have accused China of creating a debt trap for African countries. Let's look at the many forms of loans China provides to Africa. Chinese financing in Africa is diversified, with three main categories: commercial loans, concession loans, and zero-interest loans. Each type serves a different function and has various financial parameters, impacting how they affect African economies. Zero-interest loans are offered as part of China's foreign aid policy and do not bear interest. They are commonly utilized in social and humanitarian projects like schools, hospitals, and water delivery systems. Zero-interest loans are a gesture of goodwill intended to promote diplomatic relations between China and the recipient countries. Concession loans are issued at lower interest rates than the market rate and sometimes have longer repayment terms. These loans are usually utilized for large-scale infrastructure projects including highways, railways, and power plants. These loans are often managed by China's policy institutions, such as the China Exim Bank and the China Development Bank. They frequently incorporate advantageous terms to encourage development while assuring repayment viability for borrowing countries. Commercial loans have higher interest rates, equivalent to those issued by private banks. They are utilized for more financially feasible projects, with the expectation of generating enough money to offset the borrowing costs. These loans are frequently enabled by Chinese commercial banks and are targeted at industries including mining, telecommunications, and large-scale construction projects. Nevertheless, Western nations are concerned about China's influence in Africa. In response, they launched similar programs to compete with China. Let us describe these initiatives. New Western initiatives. In reaction to China's growing influence through the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, the European Union, and the United States have established infrastructure plans called Global Gateway and Build Back Better World, respectively. These efforts attempt to provide high-quality infrastructure while also meeting the developmental needs of African and other countries, with an emphasis on democratic ideals and sustainable practices. The EU's Global Gateway, revealed in 2021, is a comprehensive strategy aimed at mobilizing up to €300 billion in investments by 2027. This program focuses on creating smart, clean, and secure links in the digital, energy, and transportation sectors, as well as boosting global health, education, and research infrastructure. The Build Back Better World initiative, launched by President Biden and G7 leaders in 2021, seeks to close the global infrastructure deficit in low- and middle-income nations by using private sector financing. The program focuses on four key areas: climate, health and health security, digital technologies, and gender equity and equality. The Build Back Better World initiative stresses high standards, openness, and sustainable practices that are consistent with the aims of the Paris Climate Agreement. How do Africans see Western infrastructure projects? African viewpoints on Western infrastructure programs, like as the EU's Global Gateway and the United States Build Back Better, are diverse and complicated, reflecting both historical background and current geopolitical trends. Many Africans are skeptical of Western endeavors, noting parallels with previous colonial methods. The impression that these projects may prioritize Western interests and exert control over local requirements is a common theme. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content like this. Hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest videos. See you next time.